Hello everyone, welcome to the First Thursday Club from RSK Biocensus. Before I forget, I should just say this represents a whole year now of First Thursday Clubs, so this is the 12th one. So thank you for everybody that has attended those, or some of them. Really appreciate that and your feedback. Today we're going to be hearing from Jon Davies. He's going to be talking about how to be a good ecology expert witness at public inquiries. Just by way of brief introduction, Jon I've known for 20 years, or just working it out, and a couple of years ago I managed to entice him to come over and work for RSK Biocensus, where he's a director. Obviously an ecologist with vast amount of experience, but also heads up the RSK Wilding brand, which sits within our sort of sister company, Nature Positive. I'm going to just go through some housekeeping notes and then I'll hand over to Jon. I think many of you have been here before, but just in case you haven't, we'll mute your microphones. And the question box on your dialogue box there will allow you to ask questions throughout the presentation, and I would encourage you to do so. I'll be monitoring those as Jon's talking, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end. So please just bang the questions in there. Also any technical questions, and we can perhaps answer those while Jon's talking. After the presentation, we'll email out a questionnaire for some feedback, which would be really useful if you could fill that in. It helps us refine what we're doing. Yeah, without any further ado, I'll hand over to Jon.
Brilliant, thank you, Tim. Right then, okay, let's get cracking. So what I started off by this presentation being kind of from an ecologist perspective, but really these are external webinars that we tend to do for our clients. So there are sort of going to be two perspectives to this. I'm going to try and do it from a client's perspective. So in other words, if you are a client, if you're a developer, what should you expect from your ecology expert witness? But of course, because I'm an ecologist, I will probably slip into this what should you do to be a good ecology expert witness. So bear with me, I will flip-flop like Boris Johnson on a sandy beach over the next few minutes, but hopefully you'll all get the understanding of the sort of the advice I'm gonna impart. So I'm not going to go into detail about what public inquiries are, because you can always Google that and work out what the process is, but I'll talk a little bit about that and also why we as ecologists get involved in inquiries. For those clients out there, you know, it's about the importance of your ecologists understanding the legislation, the policy, survey guidance. You know, they really need to be genned up on this stuff, so I'll talk about that in some detail. And I'm going to give a few top tips that I've picked up from doing inquiries myself. So this isn't a kind of, you know, what inquiries are in a detailed understanding of that. It's really a few tips on how to be a good witness. That's really the idea. And at the end, I'm going to wrap up with a few examples of the sort of issues that can crop up, so you get an idea of the level of technical detail that you often go into at inquiries. So hopefully that will be of interest. So one slide on what inquiries and hearings are about. So for those that don't know, you know, a public inquiry or a hearing is really an open, independent public discussion of whether a project should go ahead, and they're generally the more large-scale projects. And so it is an opportunity to hear the objections as well as the why the proponent, the developer, feels the scheme should go ahead. So it is kind of a good way of airing these discussions in a nice kind of public, transparent way. It's also sometimes for resolving planning disputes as well. So it can kind of be either. And you will generally have two sides. We try not to make it quite so adversarial these days. Public inquiries more so because you have cross-examinations. In hearings, the whole point of hearings is it's less like that, which is probably a good thing. It's more written representations in hearings. But you will have on one side the applicant. So that's the proponent, the developer, usually, who is putting forward a scheme for planning consent, and they are applying, so they're the applicant, and then they will be up against people who think it's not such a great idea, so they're the objecting parties. And sometimes the proponent is called the appellant, so you might have heard that, and that's if it's an appeal. So that's usually where a developer is appealing if they didn't get consent in the first place. And as I said, it's really it's an opportunity to have a transparent, open, public discussion about the pros and cons of the proposed development. And it is often supported by legal teams, so that it does tend to drill down into legal detail often. But the arguments are normally set out in a fairly prescriptive way. Many of you, I'm sure, will have heard of the term proofs of evidence. So you will, as an expert witness, summarize the issues for your particular discipline in a proof of evidence, and there'll be proofs for various different people involved in the inquiry. If you are not wanting to make a public appearance at the inquiry, you can present written representations that get read out at the inquiry, or at least submitted to the inquiry. And you may well have heard of this term of rebuttals. So that's the opportunity for you to counter the argument made by the other side. So you might get a rebuttal to your proof of evidence, which says, well, we don't agree with this, this, and this. And then you actually have an opportunity to rebut the rebuttal, and it kind of goes back and forward sometimes in a bit of a ding dong. So it's like a long drawn out argument or debate, which can go on for quite a long time. And at the center of it all is the inspector or the examiner, who chairs the whole process. It's quite a formal process that's set out by the planning inspectorate. That person has to be fair and reasonable, which is good, because you know you're going to get a fair hearing whichever side of the argument you're on. They go out of their way, in my experience, to be as nice and friendly to members of the public, as it can be quite daunting for members of the public to give evidence. But sometimes when someone from the public drags on and goes on and on and on, the inspector does have to kind of step in and curtail things. But generally they'll do it in a very nice, reasonable way. And at the end of all of this kind of ding dong over many, many days, weeks, whatever it is, the inspector will write a report at the end. And I think it's worth noting that the inspector will be writing notes all the way through. So you, as an expert witness, when you are giving your evidence, you want to make sure you guide that what is being written whilst you are speaking. So it's quite a kind of a trick to emphasize the key points that you want to get across when you're giving your evidence. As ecologists, we tend to get involved often because ecology is a kind of one of the main areas for objection. Whether that's right or wrong, I think it's done quite cynically often, in which case it's quite easy to counter it at an inquiry. But often there are very good reasons, and so you are really tested on whether your assessment is true and whether the impacts that you've predicted are correct and defendable. As ecologists, we will generally, you could be the expert witness for the whole of the ecology, or when it's a bigger inquiry, it might be you get specific people in to address different disciplines or species or issues. And also you can, as an ecology witness, can be on both sides, of course. I'm generally have given evidence on the side of the developer. So I'm defending the surveys we've done and the impact assessment and the mitigation design and all of that. But sometimes you can act on the other side. So I've represented NRW, Natural Resources Wales, for example, who were not particularly happy with the ecological survey work carried out by the consultancy working for an overhead line. So you can get involved on both sides. So ecology and inquiries specifically, this really is, there is a lot of scrutiny. So it is quite a test, has to be said, and people can drill down into the detail. So I think, one of the key things you as a client would want to get across to your ecologists who are acting on your behalf is that you really want them to be comfortable that the survey methods they've used, how they report it, the timings, all of this have been done right. I mean, that's why we have survey guidance, but it doesn't come to fruition at an inquiry. It gets picked over, and so if your ecologists haven't done things at the right time of year, then that can really count against you. So even well before this stage, I think you should be encouraging, making sure your ecologists have done things the right way. This really is I guess the pinnacle, if that's the right word, of an ecologist's professional career. When you do this, when you give evidence at an inquiry, it is a real test. It's a test of your mettle as well as your understanding of detail. And yes, it does take experience. I wouldn't expect someone junior to have to do this. But I think going back to that point about surveys, even though junior ecologists won't be giving evidence at inquiry, I think every ecologist who is out doing surveys needs to understand that the way you did the surveys, when you did it, how well you did it, how well you wrote it up, all of that can get picked over at inquiries. So I think that's a very good discipline for even junior ecologists to learn, that you've got to get it right when you're doing your surveys, because inquiries can fall on the basis of surveys not being done properly. And also, evidence is everything these days. So it is a scientific discipline. So we are backing up as much of our work as possible with evidence of the surveys and how we did our assessment and all the rest of it. That doesn't mean you can't use professional judgment, because you can, but I think it's veering more towards evidence than professional judgment, which I think is a good thing, because in the old days, an old professor could kind of rack up at an inquiry, look over at his spectacles and look terribly important and say, well, this is what I think, and everyone would go, oh, okay, and it was all taken as read. These days, it's rather more based on having the right evidence. It is very important to do a good job, not just for your client, I'm talking to the ecologist here, but also because you're representing our industry, and it's become a much more professional business in the 25 years that I've been doing it, and that is good. We are a professional scientific institution, and you are representing our body when you're giving evidence as an inquiry. So that's really important to understand. So can any old ecologist be an expert witness? Well, this was a direct quote from one of my senior ecologists who came to see me in action, if that's the right word, at a public inquiry. It is intimidating, so maybe it isn't for everyone. But I think, is that a proportionate response? I think if you are a principal ecologist, you should be expecting to know your stuff, to know enough detail, to be competent enough to give evidence, certainly at a small inquiry. But it is worth saying that it is a scary prospect. You need not only to have that experience behind you, so you've got years of understanding, but also to have a level of confidence, that's for sure. But you know what, however much experience you've got, you still need to SWOT up, you still need to gen up on the detail, specifically around what you think the key issues of the case will be, so that if you're talking about dormouse surveys, for instance, then read the guidance over and over again so it's really clear on your head. There's no replacement for really swatting up and being on top of your game. So do properly understand the survey guidance, do properly understand the legislation. Those, in my experience, are the key things that an ecology expert witness will be picked up on at inquiry. There will be other things, of course, but that will be the focus of what I'm going to talk about over the next few slides. So yeah, understanding legislation and policy and guidance. So as far as the legislation is concerned, for those clients out there listening to this, that really is the least you should expect of your witness, and I'm sure you would expect them to know the legislation in and out, inside and out. To those ecologists listening, you shouldn't be afraid of reading the legislation. It's really not as complicated as you might think, and it is well worth going to the original legislation to see how it was written. And also to get the spirit of the legislation, to understand not only the precise wording, but kind of the meaning, why it was written the way it was. So I'd always recommend that you go to the original legislation, not just take someone's word and look at a summary of what the habitat regulations are, for example. So if you have an ecologist working on your behalf, and there are European protected species involved, I think you would expect your ecologist, hopefully, to know precisely what the wording under the habitats regs are, what the offences are, how that is written, the offences to kill or injure or capture or disturbance, blocking access to places of shelter, all of that sort of stuff. You'd want them to be kind of on top of that, and also to have an understanding of licensing around EPS as well, because that often gets considered in detail at inquiries. Specifically, this issue of favourable conservation status. So, your ecologist will need to understand why they feel that the mitigation that they've written out for you is sufficient to demonstrate that that species will, that in that local area, the favourable conservation status won't be compromised. So they do need to understand that sort of level of detail. Similarly, with the Wildlife and Countryside Act, there are not that many species that are protected under this that aren't European protected species, but I think you should expect your ecologists to know which those are and what the differences are. I do give a training on wildlife law, and you know, it is quite interesting how similar the language is with the protection of European protected species and Wildlife and Countryside Act protected species. It is all about not, I mean, it makes sense about not killing them, not injuring them, not disturbing them, not blocking access to shelter, not compromising their ability to breed, all this sort of stuff. It's, you know, it kind of makes sense, but it is worth, specifically if you're talking about a species that isn't in an EPS, to know what the wording is under the Wildlife and Countryside Act. And are they familiar with this idea of the incidental result legal defense? So that's it, because you can't get a license for carrying out, well, for carrying out works that would otherwise be an offence under legislation, then you have to demonstrate that work, that offence that you would cause was an incidental result of a otherwise lawful operation that could not otherwise have been avoided, is kind of the clunky phrase. But what that means is you've done enough to show that you did as much as you possibly can to avoid that offence. And that's because in England, you can't get a licence for these species, whereas you can in Scotland. And then you've got the NERC Act and the Environment Wales Act, which kind of brings into focus those habitats and species that used to be priority habitats under the UK BAP, is how you would see them. And they're now called species of principal, habitats and species of principal importance for biodiversity. So it's understanding really what the wording in that legislation is. So the Environment Wales Act under section 6 and 7, for instance, talks about this in detail. So you've got an understanding of what your responsibilities are, especially if you're acting for a public body, because public bodies have a duty to have regard for biodiversity, and there's various different wording for the different legislation. So again, go to that original legislation and understand what it says, because you might well be cross-examined on it. So on to survey guidance. Yes, your ecologist, you would hope, is really very familiar with the guidance, but what guidance? That can sometimes be the question, because you will have certain sectors, you will have sector-specific guidance. So if it's a road scheme, then the Design Manual for Roads and Bridges advice notes may apply. They're pretty old now, to be honest. Or if it's a wind farm, there could be specific survey guidance that they should be following. So you need to be clear as an ecologist that you've used the right guidance. And if not, you need a justification for why not. It is perfectly legitimate. You know, this is guidance we're talking about. It's not sacrosanct. It's not law. However, the more you diverge from the standard guidance, obviously, the harder it is to convince an inspector that you were doing the right thing. But I think if your ecologist has agreed their variation to the guidance with the consultees, then that's a pretty good insurance blanket. And that I would urge. I would also say I would much happier defend a position where I have gone back to first principles to work out when surveys should be done and why, rather than just blindly following guidance, because guidance is sometimes quite generic and isn't always as specific as it might be. So I'd rather you'd thought about it, and certainly I'd rather be cross-examined on that rather than, you know, I was just following the guidance gov. You know, it's not a very solid position necessarily, especially if the circumstances are different from normal. So an example here is that I was cross-examined on otters and we looked at the DMRB advice note on otters, and we didn't do the surveys in line with the DMRB, but frankly, the DMRB at that time was 20 odd years old, and it was written when otters were not widespread at all. So the survey specification was really written as a presence-absence thing. And so you had to do 4 surveys a year in order to demonstrate that they were absent. Well, these days that just kind of isn't really appropriate. So, you know, it can be the case that the survey guidance is not necessarily accurate. So by all means, you need to look into that in a bit more detail. Okay, so I've shamelessly nicked this from Viz magazine. Hopefully I won't get into trouble for that. Top tips. Well, if you go away with nothing other than to think preparation is key, then I'm going to say that's probably enough. You really must be prepared in many ways. So if you're a client, you would expect your expert witness to be familiar with a number of things. First of all, the wider team that you are working with. I mean, that maybe seems obvious, but it really is important to feel you're part of a team, to know the other people. The other environmental discipline leads may well be from different consultancies, but it is important that you get to know them, you get to know what their evidence is, what their arguments are, especially if we're talking about things like those other environmental issues that could have an effect on ecology, like air quality, water quality, flooding, geology and soils, all these sorts of things, noise, air quality, they all have an impact on ecology. So you need to understand what their arguments are, because that can impinge on what you're saying. But also to know what the scheme is, what the designers and engineers are talking about in their evidence, and to get to know the legal team so you feel comfortable. So don't be an outsider, I think, when you're an expert witness. Make sure you're part of the team and you're familiar with everyone you're working with. Now, this may seem an obvious one, but often, as I've kind of alluded to before, if you are senior enough to be doing an expert witness role, you're often too senior to be out there doing the survey, sadly. Heaven knows when I last did a survey. So you do need to know the development site. You know, if you are asked a question about the site and a really obvious question, you can't answer it, it looks really bad. So go to the site, have a look at it, get to know the nooks and crannies, the details, so that you get a feel for the place that you're kind of talking about. It can look pretty bad if you don't know the site. I think it's probably obvious that you should know the documentation, but there is an awful lot of documentation when you're talking about a big development project at inquiry. Certainly you'd want to be as familiar as you can with the environmental statement, but things like the construction methodologies, you really must know how the contractor is planning to build the scheme, because your assessment should have been based on that, to be honest. How do you know what the impact is going to be if you don't know what time of year they're going to be doing it or what methods they're going to be using? So do swat up as much as possible on as much of the information, the background documentation, as you possibly can. I think a familiarity with the inquiry process itself, if you're a first timer, is quite important to understand the whole principles of cross-examination and rebuttals, and making sure you address the inspector when you're speaking. All of this stuff, there is a kind of a formal approach. You don't want to feel uncomfortable. You don't want to feel you're doing things the wrong way. So familiarize yourself with that. Obviously understand the proofs of evidence, not only of your side, but also the opposition side, and as many of those as possible. Don't go, oh, well, that's not a subject that's of relevance to me. You know, the more you can swat up and understand the whole case, then I think that is the better. Certainly understand the objections to your particular discipline, if there are any. And the last thing I'd say is make sure you're familiar with the venue. There is a reason that the home teams in sport, you know, do better, is because they are comfortable, they're familiar with their surroundings. And I think if the very first, well, if when you give evidence is the very first time you've set foot in a venue, then you will kind of feel uncomfortable, you won't be at all used to it, and that will unsettle you. And I think it is worth checking out the venue beforehand, sitting in the seat you'll be sitting in. You know, that sort of stuff might sound really silly and maybe a bit obvious, but anything that makes you feel more comfortable, I think, is good. Okay, you're probably wondering why I've got that picture. So as part of preparation, I would say role play is really important. This is where you get your colleagues, or ideally other expert witnesses who really understand the whole development that is being proposed, to ask you the most horrible questions they possibly can in a fairly formal setting. So don't do this down the pub having a laugh. Just do it fairly formally and get them to really grill you, because that will not only test your mettle to see how well you respond when you're asked a difficult question, it'll give you that opportunity to take time and think about the answer, but it'll also get you practicing the answers that you might well give when you're actually on the stand. So I think it's a very, very important thing to do. And so clients out there, I think you should really be encouraging your expert witnesses to think very carefully about their case. I mean, again, that sounds really obvious, but you want them thinking, what is worrying them about their case. However well you've done your assessment, there may well be bits that you're not quite comfortable with. Don't worry about thinking about the stuff that you know you've done well. Think about the bits that you're a bit concerned about, because you can bet your bottom dollar that that's what the opposition is going to try and pick holes in. So start thinking about that. Also, I think, question what the opposing expert think about what the opposing expert might not want to be questioned on, because that way you're starting to think in detail about what the opposition's case is. These are big projects with lots of issues. You've got to focus in on what you think their key points will be at an inquiry, because however good an inspector is, there will, the decision making will be based on quite a few small things, and so you've got to think what the opposition, are trying to pick holes in, and you've got to think about how you want to counter that and how you get across your position, so that when the inspector is writing things down, they are writing down what you want them to write down. So that sort of preparation, I think, is really important. So all of that preparation I've just been talking about is there to make you as an expert witness feel relaxed and comfortable. And it'll make you as an expert witness do a better job for your client. So I think clients and ecologists alike should team up on this to work out what your best approach should be when you as an ecologist are giving evidence on their behalf. So it is a performance. So how to perform effectively. I've got that picture up there because in the old days, ecology wasn't seen as particularly professional. So it is important that you are smart and formal. This is a serious profession that we're in here. 20, 30 years ago, maybe it used to be the case that that you could just kind of amble in and say, oh, ecology is nice and lovely, isn't it? It's not like that anymore. So be as formal and professional at the inquiry as you possibly can, of course, and be courteous. And I say that because it is a formal setting. There are ways of being, certainly being courteous to the inspector. I've been at an inquiry where when I'm giving evidence, or when I was giving evidence, the opposition ecologist was tutting loudly and throwing his arms wide and all of this stuff. It was such a show, and it was very rude and frankly unjustified, and he was just trying to make it look to the inspector like I was trying to lead him up the garden path, which is completely inappropriate. So be polite and courteous. As I say, be professional but not dull. I've sat through a lot of expert witness evidence which is spoken in a monotone about very technical things. The inspector is going to probably glaze over, especially if it's a very long inquiry. So you want to cut to the chase. You want to be engaging in the way you present, and you certainly want to be professional, but you don't want to be too jargony and too dull, because you want to get across your points in a way that will kind of chime not only with the inspector but with others watching. It is really important that your expert witness should take time before they answer. So get that across. I hate an embarrassing silence. So it was difficult for me to do, but you just need to have time to master your thoughts. Don't charge into an answer straight away and say the first thing you can think of. You're allowed to take your time and think what it is that you want the inspector to be writing down about your answer. So take your time. And I would also recommend that an expert witness should, as I said earlier, you need to think about what the opposition might be wanted to drill down into, and you should prepare by getting extracts of legislation or survey guidance or whatever with post-it notes or whatever, so you can go to them when you're on the stand. You can say, oh, well, I have the that particular legislation in hand, and go to it, and you can then read out the legislation. It just looks good, looks like you're prepared, looks like you knew what the issues were going to be, and that you're there to try and help answer things as clearly as possible. I think as a client, you should also always want your expert witness to be as honest as possible, to be themselves. You come across much better that way. If you are evading the answers, it's like a politician on the Today program. You can just tell, and it's uncomfortable. So you don't want to be squirming. You don't want to be evading. You want to be as honest as you can, and that goes back to preparation, of course. And integrity. In fact, we should be speaking with integrity, with professionalism and honesty, but also, as I say here, clarity, cut to the chase, know what message you want to get across and focus on that, and don't use too much jargon. Okay, so expert witnesses really must remember they are acting for you as the client. So the whole teamwork thing is important. I don't think it's appropriate for an ecologist to be sat there in the corner throughout the inquiry, just reading a book and biding their time. Be part of it. Be as helpful as possible, I would recommend. Work with the team. Don't just do the bare minimum. I think it's, as I said earlier, important to get to know the whole team. Support the other witnesses. You know, you as the client are paying for all of this. I think you'd expect that, as a bare minimum, that all of the people you are paying are chipping in as much as they possibly can. And it looks good. It's kind of, you know, it's useful for you to think about all the other issues, because it'll help you when you're giving your evidence, because you've tested, you know, the other specialists on their evidence, for example. That will help you. And I think it's worth saying that, you know, as I said, these are very high profile, and yes, they're the pinnacle of what we as ecologists do, but it's also the case that clients, their main memory of you as an ecologist will be pretty much how you performed at this really high profile inquiry. So I think it's worth ecologists realizing that, you know, if you want future work out of a client, then this is your kind of ultimate stage. So make sure you're well prepared, and clients will want to use you again. So if ecologists come across well, as I said earlier, that will reflect well on us as an industry, but most importantly on the client. And they, you know, that's the key thing. You're representing the client here. Okay, so I will skip over these last two slides fairly quickly, but hopefully this will give you an idea of the sort of detail that you go into sometimes on inquiries. This is my M4 corridor around Newport in South Wales. I worked on a year-long inquiry, lots of issues dealt with. So I've talked about the otter survey one, actually. They also went into a lot. I think we spent a day on otters, which is kind of amazing. So I was cross-examined on whether I was an expert or whether the people who did the surveys were experts, because that word was used in the guidance. You know, the survey has to be carried out by an expert, is what it says in the DMRB. So I had to give written evidence of how many surveys the people who'd done the survey work had done in the past, how experienced they were, all this sort of stuff. So, you know, people do pick at this like it's a scab, you know, trying to get in and trying to work out where they can pick holes in your argument, you know, and if they can demonstrate that the surveys were carried out by people who don't know what they're talking about, then yeah, they're going to pick at that. We also talked at length about whether otter and waterfowl surveys could be done at the same time, which seemed a kind of rather weird argument. I mean, to my mind, yes, obviously, you know, ecologists are used, especially when doing protected species surveys, you're looking for everything. You're looking for reptiles, invertebrates, birds. You're looking for suitability of habitat for all of these things. So of course, to my mind, you can do them both at the same time. But, you know, they're trying to attack. They're trying to say, you did otters and waterfowls at the same time, therefore you can't possibly have done the otter surveys properly. So you get a sense of the sort of things. And he also picked on this idea of overland routes. We didn't mitigate for otters going overland routes. So you've got to try and think of everything you possibly can. And this is good discipline because it makes you think about your mitigation. Have you covered everything? Dormice were another big issue. I talked about favourable conservation status earlier. You know, we drilled into this in a lot of detail to the extent that we went away and worked up a very detailed, a much more detailed mitigation strategy during the inquiry. And I did that in conjunction with NRW and their specialists, because, you know, the opposition were keen for us to demonstrate that we weren't going to compromise the local population. And in order to do that, we needed to set it out in a much more detail. So that was quite an interesting one. Also, this issue was raised that the consenting authorities, in order to grant planning permission, they can only do that if they are certain that an EPS license would definitely be granted. That was case law a while back. Thankfully, it was rejected by this newer case law, Woolley v East Cheshire. But it gives you an idea that you know, again, these are the sorts of issues that people drill down into. And in this circumstance, this is, of course, why we do ghost licenses, if you've encountered that. you can't actually submit a license application until you get consent. So it's all a bit chicken and egg, but that's why we submit the license application that we would be submitting along with the detailed method statement, so that we can get what's called a letter of no impediment from Natural England or NRW to say they have no reason to think that they wouldn't give you a license. So you can submit that to an inquiry. There you go. There's no reason to think we won't get a license. And of course, that's important because it would be daft for someone making a decision to grant consent to do that and then find out that a license isn't going to be given, because then their consent is almost kind of breaking the law. Okay, last slide, don't worry. Bats, this was another key issue of the inquiry. Again, we had a long time talking about this. Wasn't me specifically, actually, it was a different witness who was addressing bats. But the barrister, sorry, on the opposition side, had a bit of a bee in his bonnet about the phraseology deliberate disturbance from the habitats regulations. And so he was suggesting that building a road counted as deliberate disturbance. Therefore, we were causing an offence by doing it. He had the same issue. He was suggesting that if you're driving along the road when it's built and you kill a bat, then that's deliberate disturbance. So you can go down some weird rabbit holes, I have to say, at inquiry. In that case, don't worry, if you are driving on a road, you're not breaking the law if you accidentally kill a bat. It's not a strict liability offence. So you can't say I didn't know it was there, Gov, which is the case with roosts. That is a strict liability offence. So if you do take out a bat roost and you didn't know it's there, you have no defence in law. Worth knowing. And that's why we do surveys, of course. That's why you're required to do surveys for roosts. And then he also felt that this phrase that most of you will be familiar with, beyond reasonable scientific doubt, that burden of proof, which applies currently pretty much just to Natura 2000 sites, European sites in the HRA process. So in an appropriate assessment, you have to demonstrate beyond reasonable scientific doubt that you're not going to have an effect on the integrity of that site. He thought that should be applied to the species as well. We had quite a bit of a ding-dong about that. That would make surveys way more onerous, because you'd need way more proof to meet that burden of proof. So I think that would have made our industry and development much less likely to happen, because it would just drag everything out. So that didn't come to fruition, thankfully. How many people, I wonder, are familiar with Section 28G of the Wildlife and Countryside Act? I certainly wasn't ahead of this inquiry. But under that, public bodies, and we were representing Transport Wales, have a duty to take reasonable steps consistent with the proper exercise of the authority's functions to further the conservation and enhancement of the flora and fauna. And it was the contention of Friends of the Earth and RSPB that building a road through the Gwent levels was not consistent with that. However, it is worth saying, and this was our argument, that proper exercise of the authority's function, Transport Wales is not a conservation body. Their function is to build infrastructure. So as long as what they were doing was taking reasonable steps, and we had a very comprehensive mitigation strategy, which was designed to further the conservation enhancement. So we, I think, made our case pretty strongly. But again, you get the sense here that the opposition will try and pick holes, looking at the legislation, looking at the wording of the legislation to try and pick holes in your argument. Okay, so we've got 10 minutes left, I think, till the end. So let's leave time for questions very quickly then. Take home messages. The methods, timing, and quality of surveys really can be scrutinized in detail. Not only does your expert witness need to be on top of that, but I think all ecologists need to be aware that can happen down the line. So make sure you're doing surveys at the right time of year. Inquiries do throw up these interesting points, as I hopefully have just illustrated. And your expert witnesses really need to understand the implications of the policy and the legislation, because you will get examined in minutiae often at inquiry. That's the point, that's the purpose of the legal representatives at inquiries, to try and pick holes. So make sure you understand the legislation. As I said earlier, read it in detail, the actual legislation. Right, okay, that's been a very whistle-stop tour. Don't, for goodness sake, think that you now know how to be an expert witness. I've just given that as a few top tips, a few lessons learned. It's not a full training session. So for goodness sake, if you are going to be an expert witness, I would recommend that you have a proper training in it, because it is quite a challenge. Right. So any questions? Tim, back to you.
Thanks very much, John. Yeah, thanks for, like you say, a whistle-stop tour through the world of expert witnesses. We've got a few questions. Well, the first one I'll go to is, what should clients be looking for in an expert witness? Are there any accreditations, etc.?
Oh, crumbs. I don't think there are accreditations. I think that you would, if you want to be sure that you've got a good expert witness, then there's nothing quite like experience. So people who have done it before and find out how well they performed from others who were at that inquiry, I would say. I don't think there is an accreditation. You do want someone who's been around the block a lot and someone who's quite confident. But yeah, no, I don't think there are. The more they've got chartered status and full sign membership and all that stuff, I think the better, obviously, because they're kind of protected by our codes of conduct and what have you.
Okay, thank you. Other one here was guidelines for surveys change over time. Would you have to argue according to the latest guidelines?
That's a very good question. I knew where that was going. No, you don't. You only need to do surveys in accordance with the guidance that was extant at the time that you did them. We've had this time and again, actually. You are not required to go back and redo them or even justify them in terms of the new guidance. So there is a real cutoff. Clearly, if the guidance changes, halfway through the surveys that you're doing, then you should think about doing them in line with the new guidance. But as I said before, as long as you give a good justification for why you've done stuff, then that is sufficient. Yeah, I think that's a good question, but it's, yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
One here, I guess I sort of know the answer to this, but I suppose it's something that does possibly worry some ecologists that are working or being asked to work as expert witnesses. Does acting against appellants have a negative impact on your business? I guess the point being that if you're known for arguing against somebody that could potentially be a client of yours in the future, then you're less likely to get work from them.
Well, I think it can, to be honest. But that shouldn't really stop you doing it. The whole point here is we're trying to argue the case in favor of what is the right thing to do for ecology, whether you're acting on behalf of the proponent or the opposition. Fact is, if you're arguing, if you're an expert witness on behalf of the appellant or the applicant, then you will have done a good job for them, which is, I would hope, that is making sure that ecology and biodiversity is conserved and enhanced through the mitigation strategies that you have developed for them. So either way, it should be fine. You're just if you are representing the other side, then that's maybe it means that the ecologists that have done work for the proponent hadn't done a good job. And so it just ratchets up to make sure you get better ecology done throughout the industry. But it's a fair point. I personally didn't feel worried that I represented NRW against a developer, because I did feel that the ecologists who'd done that survey work hadn't done a very good job. I thought it was pretty shoddy. And frankly, airing that in public and making sure they do a better job in the future is probably a good thing. As a profession, we have got more professional over the years because of this sort of thing. It's continuous improvement.
Yeah, I have a question here that's sort of linked to that, which is, should ecologists act as expert witnesses for projects where they feel that the ecology work was substandard?
Really good question. And in fact, some of the work that I was defending at the M4 around Newport was to a degree substandard, done at slightly the wrong time of year. So that I had to have good arguments for that. I think as long as you feel that the mitigation, you can defend the mitigation design, and I absolutely did. I mean, funnily enough, I thought the ES, some of the ES chapters, the assessment was kind of overly cautious to my mind, and I was more than happy to defend it. So it'll always be done, if you're defending someone else's work, it will always have been done in a way that's different to how you would have done it. But I think as long as ultimately you feel that the development should go ahead or can go ahead and that there are safeguards in place, then you should be happy to defend. And things will always have been done slightly maybe out of season. I mean, that's why we all have a limitations section in our chapters or our PEA reports. You know, it might have been too cold, slightly too cold, or slightly the wrong time of year, or whatever. You know, the survey guidance is guidance, and if you err from it slightly, it really isn't the end of the world necessarily. It just maybe makes your evidence slightly weaker, but it doesn't, you know, generally doesn't mean that it's completely pointless.
Okay, probably just conscious of time, so just one last quick question. Is it possible to go and watch a public inquiry to gain experience?
Yeah, and I'd urge you to. Absolutely, you can. Yeah. Funny enough, the M4 inquiry, we had an absolute capacity crowd on day one, and thereafter it was about 3 people and a dog for the rest of the year. So yeah, the more people the merrier, frankly. And as I say, I think if you are an ecology practice, it is a really good idea to get some of your more senior ecologists at least to go along and see what it's about. Absolutely, prepare them for it early. They may have a response like the woman I quoted in my talk and think, God, I never want to do this. But that's fine. That means you can focus on the people who are more likely to be happy to do it. It's just really good experience. And I would say you could take any ecologist along, because that idea of even the most junior ecologists realizing the level of scrutiny that their survey work that they're out doing on a day-to-day basis might be put under is really good for them to understand. You know, that's why we say to you, please do the surveys according to this, you know, the methodology we've set out for you. Do it at the right time. If you for some reason miss something out, then tell us. You know, it's all good. It's all good, useful background information. Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks again, John, for that. Just remains for me to say thank you to everybody that was in attendance today, and hope you've got as much out of that as I did. Our next First Thursday Club is on the 2nd of September, where Rob Fear and James Butler are going to, from our arboricultural team, are going to be talking about the consideration and protection of trees on development sites. We will be sending out that questionnaire shortly after this, so please take time to fill that in, and we'll look forward to seeing you all in a month's time. Thank you very much.